Okay, my last lesson of the day. Algebra 2. We will wait to see if anyone wants to join. Oh, somebody popped up. I think it looks like Claire. Hey, Claire. We are doing a pretty easy lesson today. It is April 28th. This is Algebra 2. We've been working with quadratic equations. The last lesson we did was on solving by factoring. I believe that was this class. Yeah, we did solving by factoring. And today we are going to do another way to solve. And then the next lesson we're going to do another way. There's like 4 different ways that we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations. This one is probably one of the easiest, except it does have some square roots of negative numbers involved, which I remember whenever we learned that in school, some of y'all had a little bit of a hard time with it, with the i's, the imaginary numbers. But for the most part, this is pretty easy. So our goal is to solve a quadratic equation using square roots. So if you look at this example 1, it says solve for d. So we have this equation, d squared equals 9. So all you have to do, whenever you're solving a quadratic equation, you look for the easiest method. And I told you before, we're going to be learning some other methods. We learned how to solve by factoring. Now we're learning how to solve with square roots. And if you only have your d squared term and then another number, then I would always solve it using square roots, because all you need to do is get d by itself on one side of your equal sign. So that means if you have another number over here with your d, you want to solve your equation just for that letter by moving everything to the other side. But in this example 1, it's already in the right form. Your 9's already over here on the right side, and your d's over here by itself. Now you have d to the second, and we want it to just be d. We don't want it to be d to the second. So you have to do the opposite operation of squaring something, which is taking the square root. So we're going to take the square root of this left side. And when you take the square root of a square, it just cancels those two out, and you're left with your d. So anytime you have your variable squared, you just take the square root of it, and it cancels the little 2 out, and you're just left with the letter. Then, just like any equation, if you do something to one side, you've got to do it to the other side of the equation. So you take the square root of 9. Now, the square root of 9 is 3, but it's also negative 3, because negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. So, and that's always the case when you are solving a radical equation, or when you're solving an equation by taking the square root, you always are going to have, well, you're not always going to have, but in most cases you're going to have two answers, and it's going to be the positive and the negative. And so we usually put plus or minus together like that, and that would be your answer. However, on IXL, they want you to enter the two separate answers in. So they're going to have D equals and D equals, and you're going to have to fill it in with positive 3 and negative 3. But that's what plus or minus means. So anytime you're solving an equation and you take the square root to get your answer, you always put plus or minus. And it's just going to be the positive answer and the negative answer. Okay, so let's look at this for a minute before we move on, just to make sure you understand that. So let's say you had x squared equals 16, and you're supposed to solve that. You just take the square root of each side, and you're going to get x equals plus or minus. You just need to get in the habit of always doing plus or minus the square root of 16, which is 4. And so that would mean positive 4 or negative 4. Now, the ones on your IXL that are positive, that start out positive like our 9 did, it's going to be that easy. Now, of course, you're going to have some that have negatives, and a lot of the ones on IXL I did had negative numbers, like this negative 25. And the difference in this one is when you take the square root of both sides, like when you take the square root of this side, and then you take the square root of this side, and you get R equals, that's a negative 25, and you can't really take the square root of a negative number. You can, but it's an imaginary number. Remember, we learned about imaginary numbers. And so when you say plus or minus this time, you don't just put 5, you've got to put 5i. Remember the i's? So when you take the square root of negative 25, remember that. You can use your calculator if the i's confuse you. But you just take the square root of the 25 and then put an I with it because it's negative. So your answers are 5i or negative 5i. Okay, then you're going to have some problems like example 3. Instead of telling you to solve, it'll just ask you how many or what type of solutions you have. And so if you look at this example 3, it says how many, and I put what type, solutions does this have? And this first problem is x squared equals negative 100. Well, if it were positive 100, you would have two real solutions. Okay, because of the positive and negative, you're going to always get two solutions unless there's a 0 inside. If there's a 0, if it's the square root of 0, there's only one solution, and it's 0. But if you have any other number that's positive, you're always going to have two real solutions. But if you have a number that's negative, we're going to get one like in example 2. You're going to have two solutions, but they're imaginary because they have the i's with them. So if it's x squared equals negative 100, the answer is going to be 2 imaginary. And they'll have multiple choice. They'll have multiple choice answers on your IXL. So anytime it asks you what type of solutions and you have a negative number over here, then it's always going to be 2 imaginary. If it's like this one, part B, x squared equals 36, it's going to be 2 real solutions. And I believe, I don't know if they'll ever give you any, like I said, any zeros. The only time you'll ever get one solution is if it's x squared equals 0. because when you take the square root of both sides, you get x equals, and you can't have plus or minus 0, you just get 0. So that would be the only time you would only have one solution. On these, because you know how to work imaginary numbers, you're not going to ever get any no solutions. It's either going to be 2 reals or 2 imaginaries. All right, example 4. On this one, solve for u. U squared equals negative 52. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. And you get u equals, remember to always do plus or minus. When you take the square root of, just don't worry about the negative right now, but when you take the square root of 52, you've got to remember how to pull out a perfect square. Let me go back to, well, I'll just write on this piece of paper. I'm going to go ahead and pull that negative sign out as an I, just so we won't have to deal with the negative anymore. And then we're going to simplify the 52. So that is going to be plus or minus I. Remember, when you're simplifying the square root of 52, you're looking for a factor of 52. That is a perfect square, which is 4. And so that's 4 times 13. And then you take the square root of 4, which comes out as a 2. And you get 2 on the square root of 13. And you've got this I in front that's being multiplied. And remember, it's plus or minus. All right, so we're going to write that in a better way. That is going to be plus or minus 2i, put the 2 in front of the I, on the square root of 13. Now, the way you're going to enter that on the I itself, you're going to have to do 1 plus and 1 minus. So that would be u equals 2i on the square root of 13, or negative 2i on the square root of 13. And that's it on that one. All right, moving on to example 5. Let's see, it looks like my pen smeared, or I got sloppy or something on example 5. That is a negative 17. So solve for n. N squared equals the square root of negative 17. This one's really easy. I just wanted to make sure you knew what to do if you don't have a perfect square that will come out of that number under the radical sign. We're going to take the square root. Hang on, that's a bad problem right there. I was making these examples out last night at 1:30 a.m. and you can tell. Let me rewrite that. It should be n squared equals negative 17. That's how the problem should start. And so now we're going to solve it by taking the square root of both sides. So when you take the square root of this left side, you just get n equals, we're going to take the square root of the right side. Remember, when you solve an equation by taking the square root, it's always plus or minus. And then there's no perfect square in 17, and that you can't simplify 17 any further. All you can do is bring that negative on the outside as an I, and then you're left with your 17. And that's it, except you're going to have to enter it in as a positive I on the square root of 17, or a negative I on the square root of 17. I don't know if anyone is still on here or not. It looks like everyone left. Are you still here, Claire? All right, moving on to example 6. We have x squared equals 98. We're solving for x. So we're going to take the square root of each side. When you take the square root of x to the second, you're left with x. The square root of 98 is a positive number, so you don't have to worry about any i's. But you do need to factor that into two factors. One has to be the highest perfect square that will divide into 98. 49 is the largest perfect square that will divide into 98. So 49 times 2. And then you take the square root of 49, which is 7, and that comes on the outside. And don't forget to do your plus or minus. So x equals positive 7 on the square root of 2, or negative 7 on the square root of 2. Example 7. Now look at this one. This one starts out a little differently. We have x squared minus 26 equals negative 44. We have to get x squared all by itself on one side of the equation. So we've got to move this minus 26 by adding 26 to make that cancel out. And then we have to do the same exact thing on the right side. And that leaves you with x to the second equals negative 44 plus 26 is going to be negative 18. All right, so now we're down to the part where we take the square root of both sides, because everything's moved away from our x squared, so now we can take the square root of each side. That's going to leave you with x equals, remember to always do your plus or minus. There is a negative number, which means I is going to be involved in your answer. And then you have to remember how to simplify the square root of 18. 18 is the same thing. Let me bring the negative out as an I, so we don't have to worry about that. And I'm going to factor 18 as 9 times 2. Remember, I'm just simplifying the square root of 18. Once I have it factored, I take the square root of 9, which is 3. And I'm going to let that 3 come in front of the I. So that's going to be 3i on the square root of 2. And then, of course, the way that you'll enter that, let me write that over here. The way that you're going to enter that in IXL. Now, if it was just for me on a worksheet or on test, you could just leave it like this, plus or minus 3i on the square root of 2. But they're going to want you to enter it as x equals positive 3i on the square root of 2, or negative 3i on the square root of 2. This is pretty boring whenever no one's on here with me. I think, let's see, is this our last one? Let me look. It is our last example. Well, I've got these two, 8 and 9. Okay, we're back to this one. How many or what type of solutions are in this equation? All right, before you can tell how many solutions, we need to get r squared by itself, so we need to move that minus 16. So I'm going to do plus 16 on both sides. And that leaves you with r squared equals 16. So you can stop right there and say, because 16 is positive, you're going to have 2 real solutions. Remember, if it was a negative 16, it would be imaginary. And then our last example, we're going to solve for D. Okay, so look, we've got negative 36d to the second equals 1. This negative 36 can't be there. We need for d squared to be all alone. Kind of like me right now. All alone. So we've got to get negative 36. Grown from the d squared, so we have to divide by it. Because it's right in front of d squared. It's attached to it through multiplication. So we divide by negative 36 on both sides. So it cancels out right here. And you get d to the second equals negative 1 over 36. Because when you have a fraction with one negative in it, the whole fraction is negative. So now you're ready to take the square root of each side. And you'll get d equals, there is a negative number under the radical, so that comes out as an I. And then you just take the square root of 1 and the square root of 36. So when it comes out, you're going to get plus or minus, because remember it's always plus or minus. And then the square root of 1 is 1, and the square root of 36 is 6. And then you just put your I on the end. So plus or minus 1/6 I. And that would be, and I'll do it over here, d equals positive 1/6 I or negative 1/6 I. And that's it with this lesson. It's pretty easy. And of course you can use your calculators to help you simplify these radicals. Let me know if you need any help. Y'all have, oh wait, whoa. I've got to show you the IXL assignment. Okay, your assignment, IXL, Algebra 2, J6. We're moving on with our J's. Y'all take care. See you later.